when I was preparing for this, I thought, oh, this is great. I'm usually very, very good at chairing these sorts of discussions. I can sort of interrupt important people, no problem, and keep them moving along. But these 5, I honestly think I could just let them go, just let them sort of chat away and tell us more and more of their work, their thoughts, kind of the change that they want to see in the world. So we will all together, all 6 of us, will do our very best at staying as somewhat brief as possible. Otherwise, we will not necessarily be able to rely on my usually quite strict chairing timer. Let me introduce you. So the first up is writer and speaker, Sir Dermot Turing. And Dermot is the nephew of Alan Turing, and he spent the last 7 years rewriting the history books to tell the real story of what happened at Bletchley Park and debunking myths surrounding his uncle's legacy. He's the author of several books, but I particularly want to recommend Reflections of Alan Turing, A Relative Story, which he published earlier this year. Next up is Dr. ClaraMBarker. Clara is the manager for the Centre for Applied Superconductivity in the Materials Department at the University of Oxford. And she's also the Dean of Equality and Diversity at Whitaker College. She sits on the Royal Society's Diversity Committee and is a vocal campaigner for trans rights, winning a Point of Light award from the then Prime Minister Theresa May in 2017. If you joined us for AI UK a few months ago, you will have heard what a lot of people said was probably the best panel of the event, due in no small part to the contributions from Dr. Shakir Mohamed. Shakir is a research scientist and lead at DeepMind, working on technical and socio-technical questions in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And they also sit on the Royal Society's Diversity Committee. Shakir's research is focused on real-world applications of machine learning and AI that address global challenges and social transformation. Moving swiftly on to the person with the best hair on the panel so far, not so far, of all 6 of us, is Professor Sue Black. Sue is a professor of computer science and a technology evangelist at Durham University. Sue is credited for saving Bletchley Park after a 3-year social media campaign to restore the deteriorating site. And you can read about that in her book called Saving Bletchley Park that was published a few years ago. She was awarded an OBE for services to technology on the 2016 Queen's New Year's Honours List. And I know this is a lot of talking from me, but I'm going to just bring it home strong with my colleague at the Turing Institute, Dr. David Leslie, who's a writer and philosopher. He's an ethics fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, where he is also the ethics theme lead. He's an elected member of the Bureau of the Council of Europe's Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence and a founding editor of the Springer journal AI and Ethics. And he has authored several articles on the legacy of Alan Turing, one of which you can read on our on the Turing's website. I really strongly recommend it. So I hope that is going to be the largest amount of my talking for the next little bit. And I'm going to kick us all off with a question for Dermot, if that's okay. So Dermot, there's just 1 week to go until the new £50 banknote is released into circulation. We've come a really long way since Alan Turing's work. What does all of the activity around the £50 note signify to you, signify to others? And what do you think Alan Turing would have made of it?
Okay, well, that's lots of questions, but thank you for kicking us off with that. So let's start with the £50 note. If you have had a chance to see the image of the new £50 note, and of course next week you will do, if you haven't seen the Bank of England's publicity on it so far, you'll see that it doesn't big up on the whole code breaking thing. And I think that's very interesting. And I think that points the way perhaps to some of the discussion that we might have in a moment. If you stop anybody in the street and are lucky enough to come across anybody who has heard of Alan Turing, they will probably say something like, oh, that was the famous code breaker who then got persecuted by the state because he was gay. And I have to say, I'm personally quite uncomfortable with that sort of potted summary of his life, and I probably need to justify that remark. First of all, he didn't spend a great deal of his life actually at Bletchley Park, and when he was at Bletchley Park, he didn't do a great deal of code breaking. People will probably be offended, disgusted, appalled, and horrified by that remark. I can justify it if people want me to. He certainly had a major role in inventing this incredible machine called the bomb machine, which found the settings on Enigma cipher machines that were being used by the Germans. And that was an astonishing breakthrough. And I don't want anybody to go away thinking I'm trying to disparage that achievement. But that can easily be seen as a piece of applied mathematical logic as much as a piece of code breaking. And then after that, he didn't really do a great deal of code breaking at Bletchley Park. He didn't do nothing, but he didn't do a great deal. And after 1942, he wasn't at Bletchley Park at all. So that kind of perhaps tells us that we should look elsewhere to see why Alan Turing was famous. And in his lifetime, he was famous as a computer pioneer, as the founder of computer science, as the founder of a whole branch of mathematics called computability. He was a logician, a mathematical biologist, a designer of computer logic, computer languages, and computing machines. And all those things are pretty amazing achievements without even needing to go near the code breaking thing. We also probably ought briefly to mention the other part of the standard story of Alan Turing's life, which is that he was persecuted by the state because of his sexuality, and that caused him to take his own life. I'm not going to apologize for the state of society in 1952, which had mounted what I characterize as a pogrom against gay men. It isn't true that for the entire duration of the piece of legislation under which Alan Turing was prosecuted, that the state was consistent in the way it applied it. It depended on which way the Home Secretary was thinking at the time. And unfortunately, in the early 1950s, we had a very conservative, with a small c, as well as a big one, but a very conservative Home Secretary who decided that being gay was something that was disgusting and it affronted him, and therefore he wanted it swept off the streets. And so the police were instructed to round up as many gay men as they could get their hands on. Now, we all know that the result of Alan Turing being prosecuted was that he was sent off to be given this treatment in the form of hormone injections. And this is, frankly, I mean, I'm delighted we have things like the Alan Turing Institute now to try and keep us on the straight and narrow when it comes to doing science right. Because, frankly, what happened is wasn't the judge that decided that he should have the hormone treatment. That wasn't within the judge's capacity to do that. It was the medics. And we had an appalling state of non-science in the early 1950s where the medics, frankly, cooked up whatever kinds of experimental treatment they fancied and tried them out on gay people. And that was absolutely appalling. So the treatment wasn't really at the hands of the state. It was at the hands of the psychiatric profession. And I think we should look to them to explain their actions, though none of them are around anymore to give that account of themselves. But also, I don't see a causal link. We can go into this if people are interested, but perhaps I don't want to distract from the other panelists. But I don't see a causal link between that hormone treatment, which Alan Turing was off and had put well behind him by the middle of 1953, and his death a year later. So we have to look elsewhere for the causes of why he took his own life. So to round up, you asked me at the end of your litany of questions, Kirstie, you asked me what Alan Turing would make of all of this, and in particular the £50 note thing. So to be very brief, I think first of all he's a shy guy, and so I think he would have been really quite sort of if you like, appalled by the fact that he was getting all this publicity, because it would have meant that he had to do things like appear on the TV and all that kind of stuff, and he would have hated that. But on the other hand, I think he would have been delighted that we're actually celebrating some of the more intellectual side of his achievements on the £50 note, rather than harping back to this sort of mawkish and probably inaccurate life story that people carry around with them.
I thank you. I know I asked you a very big question, and you took us in so many different directions. It was really wonderful. I'm going to ask Clara about the sort of the legacy of relating to kind of what it means to have Alan Turing on the £50 note and what it means to represent a gay man on the £50 note. But I want to just ask you one follow-up question, Dermot, which is, I love this point that he was at Bletchley Park, but really didn't do a huge amount of code breaking whilst he was there. And what I was thinking when you were describing that is that he probably, well, I suppose my question is, did he leave a legacy at Bletchley Park? So was there something about him being there that then allowed others to be able to kind of carry that work forwards? Or could he really have been switched out with sort of any other smart person who came along and worked in that team?
Oh, no, okay, glad you asked that, because actually I think his legacy at Bletchley Park was probably, apart from the bomb machine, was probably the most enduring mark that he made there. Back in the 1930s, British code breaking was all about language. It was about, if you like, filling in crossword puzzles where you know some of the words and have to guess what the rest are and see what fits and so forth. So they were very keen on hiring linguists, and it took a bit of an intellectual, it was a piece of intellectual bravery actually by the part of Bletchley Park management to consider hiring mathematicians. Their first mathematician was a guy called Peter Twin, who arrived just before Alan Turing did. Alan Turing was in the first group of mathematicians, but not the very first. I think his legacy there, though, was really about forcing the code breakers to think about code breaking in a mathematical way. And in particular, he rediscovered for them Bayes' theory of probability, which we're learning to think about right now in the middle of the pandemic, which is the probability that X is the case given that Y is the case. Bayesian statistics, Bayesian probability is actually very tough. I mean, I think I was taught it at school and I was very bad at it, and have subsequently forgotten it all. But I remember it being tough at the time. And I feel sorry actually for the politicians at the minute who are actually having to grapple with this stuff every day in their decision making. What's the probability that if they do this, then it will actually make the R rate go down, or whatever it might be. But Alan Turing reintroduced this idea at Bletchley Park in the early 1940s, and it was very heretical to do so because everybody thought of probability in terms of sampling and Gaussian distributions and all that good stuff, which nobody's suggesting that was invalid, but the idea that you could use it to inform your guesswork, that sort of somehow seemed improper, it seemed unscientific. And he coaxed them along without using Bayes' name to get them to embrace it, and I think helped basically put that form of statistics back on the map. Highly influential, and I think that's part of the reason why he continued to be a consultant for GCHQ after World War II. So although he wasn't formally at Bletchley Park after 1942, he was in and out of the place and in and out of GCHQ for many years.
I love that. Thank you. I love that phrasing around intellectual bravery. And I hope that there are a lot of my colleagues at the Alan Turing Institute, but also sort of scientists and researchers around the world who really resonate with that, this lens of sort of coming in and looking at maybe an old or oldish problem from a different lens. So I'm going to switch over to Clara. And as we've sort of talked about, we're here to celebrate the new £50 note, and it's Alan Turing's birthday. But it's also Pride Month, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge that LGBTQ plus rights have come a long way since sort of in the last few decades. And there are more and more LGBTQ plus celebrities and public figures who are finding success and paving their way. There's still a decent amount more work, I think, to do. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about Alan Turing as a role model, the fact that he's being celebrated, but maybe kind of role models in general, thinking about kind of how do you look back in time and look for role models when they maybe weren't able to be their full selves, or their full selves were not captured in the history books for us.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to look at the history of role models. I think it's really important, and it's had an impact on me personally. So when I went to school, it was during there was a law in the UK called Section 28, where it was basically illegal to talk about LGBTI plus people, similar to what just got passed in Hungary yesterday, for those that are paying attention globally. And so it was effectively, you couldn't talk about being LGBT. And even though it didn't technically cover schools, all of a sudden, gay teachers weren't allowed to be themselves. They weren't allowed to be open. And so there was no discussion. It's interesting. I was actually talking about this yesterday in a school. I did a talk on this and mentioned Alan Turing as I did. But there was just no talk of LGBTI plus people. We were sort of effectively erased, even though we existed. And we didn't have the internet back then. We only had 4 TV channels. So I just assumed I was broken. I thought that there was something wrong with me personally. I didn't have anyone that I could look around and go, oh, I'm like them. And so as it happens, even though I was doing well at school, I ended up dropping out because of poor mental health before I completed school. And sadly, we still see similar sort of numbers. We still see elevated rates of LGBTI plus people dropping out of school. I did manage to get back into university. I did a foundation degree. Funnily enough, one of my courses was on the site of the Manchester Baby, the first programmable computer. So that's kind of cool. And it was an engineering degree. But this never went away. My gender identity never went away, and I still didn't feel I could talk about it. And I did a PhD, I did postdocs around the world, I lived in different countries, but I met 2 out LGBTI plus scientists in 14 years. And so I assumed that when I transitioned, I could no longer be a scientist. Now, I'm happy to report that I came to Oxford just to prove how terrible it was going to be. And, I'm still here 7 years later. So it turns out it was better than I expected. But I had a lot of assumptions based on the fact that I didn't see any LGBT scientists around me. I didn't see any trans scientists around me. And it turns out I'm not the only trans scientist. Turns out there's flipping loads of us. But I didn't know that because there was just no visibility. And so it's really important when society is promoting LGBTI plus people, but especially for me and other people, LGBTI plus scientists. And whilst we can't go back through the history books, I mean, it's like with disabilities. We don't know if someone was gay. We don't know if someone was neurodivergent because we can't ask them. But, there's a good chance that some people might have been, but we've got an almost hidden history. And so those few figures, they're really, really important to us. And Turing, like I say, I was talking about Turing just yesterday. And I'd love to say that, science is free from discrimination, but more and more we're finding out that that's not true, that there is discrimination. And I think Dermot mentioned non-science as well, is also a really important point. So, we talk about how science is free from discrimination, but Turing was someone that still had a lot to give. They still had more work to do, and we lost them because of societal discrimination. And so role models are so important.
One of the things that I'm really inspired about is that the vaccination technology for coronavirus is now being applied to the HIV virus, which has led to the AIDS pandemic. And I think there's a really interesting aspect of why, AIDS has been around for a really long time. Why wasn't there more investment in that area? And I don't know if you have any thoughts on whether it's because there are still there's still stigma associated with both being gay, maybe drug use, and the sort of the stigma that is associated with that means that it's less likely for people to engage in trying to discover those vaccines, because it was there, it just wasn't invested in maybe by those large corporations. Do you think I'm taking us off down a sort of a strange path here, or do we think we need more people to be advocating for those needs inside of the science community?
I think that there's probably an awful lot of truth in that there wasn't the research, or it was stigmatized because of what it was. These days we have more sort of misinformation when it comes to vaccines, but there was also a lot of misinformation when it comes to gay people, for example, which were specifically hit by hit by HIV. And so all that misinformation, of course, people want to stay away from it. It's misinformation isn't anything new, despite what many people might tell you on the internet. It's always existed. It's just that people have a louder voice at the moment. But yeah, there's no way it did impact. And I know this. I spoke to some people who were working in the 80s on AIDS, and they said that the hospitals didn't want to work with them. They didn't want to give them the space. They were worried about other people being infected. There was just this fear around it, and that was stoked by the government's view. I mean, it was on the front page of newspapers at the time. The AIDS, what was it? The AIDS epidemic. The gay man's plague. This was on the front page of newspapers. So yeah, it definitely affected how we worked on it.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing your experience of being in school, of being silenced. And I just want to link back to this kind of, it does stem from government policy. And I saw an article that was released either yesterday or today showing that something like 90% of LGBTQ plus youth in schools these days experience bullying. So it's absolutely not something that's gone away even a few decades later. I want to just bring in Dermot, because I'm curious to know a little bit more about the Alan Turing law, and how that sort of government policy has spun out. And I don't know if there's any sort of misunderstandings or misinformation around what people think about it.
Well, thanks, Kirstie. I mean, I'm sorry, Clara, I've got bad news for you here as well, because I think part of what makes people feel nostalgic and warm about the Alan Turing story is that it's widely believed that we've kind of turned the corner on gay rights, and it's kind of like a done deal. And one example of that, why it's probably not right, is you'll probably recall that after Alan Turing received his royal pardon, everybody started saying, well, why have they singled out this one guy just because he happened to be famous? And what about the rest of us? And why don't we deserve pardons? And there's an awful lot of nonsense around the pardon anyway. There's a whole load of legal reasons why it's completely inside out and upside down. We won't go into those today. But I looked into this because I've got a legal training. I sort of looked into what Alan Turing's law actually does. This is the thing that ostensibly gives pardons to everybody else and therefore sort of sets the record straight. Turns out that, yes, you can have a pardon under Alan Turing's law if you happen to be dead. But if you're one of those inconvenient people who happen still to be alive, then no, you don't get your pardon automatically. You have to go on bended knee to the Home Office and ask them for one. And actually, there's about a 50% failure rate. There's lots of excuses why they won't give pardons to people. And some of the things are frankly impossible for people who were convicted way back in the late 50s, early 60s to prove, like sort of whether the offence for which they were convicted took place in the public loo, and those kinds of things. I mean, all these people pleaded guilty, so there's no evidence that that they can actually point to show things one way or the other. So, frankly, the idea that Alan Turing's law has somehow sort of closed the book on sort of anti-gay discrimination, it's absolute nonsense. And I am sure that we should continue to point to Alan Turing as a role model of somebody who, despite, and let's just remember that he wasn't openly gay. You couldn't be openly gay, otherwise you were going to be locked up. Despite his sexuality, managed to sort of carry on and, frankly, overcame that sort of discrimination and feelings of disgust by other people in society. I have to say, just there was a footnote, the people that he worked with on the whole were very tolerant and accepting of his sexuality. And so it wasn't that everybody in society felt the same way about it. He certainly managed to find himself in communities where it kind of didn't matter. And, you know, so there's a positive there, but I just don't say that we have closed the book on it, even though perhaps the politicians would like us to think so.
Thank you so much for filling us in on that. And I want to sort of take us over to Shakir. Shakir, I saw you nodding an awful lot when Dermot was talking about Bayes theory and sort of the re-implementation and how valuable Bayes theory is. But I know a lot of people will, certainly a lot of my colleagues at the Turing Institute saw you speak on this panel that I referred to earlier on doing better in data science. So, the subtitle was From Algorithmic Fairness to Diversity. And I want to pick up on a point that you made there about the breadth of our identity informs so much of our thinking. And so thinking about kind of these individual people, but also the people that they then collaborate with, that they work with. How do you trace the creative journey from Alan Turing's work to modern, but look forwards as well to future artificial intelligence? How do you sort of think about the work that he did and place it into a sort of perspective around team efforts? And I know a lot of people are talking about queering machine learning. I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
Thanks so much, Kirstie, and what an amazing panel to be on. I will just start by saying to everyone who just heard 5 minutes ago that Bayes is hard, as someone who has a PhD in Bayesian statistics, don't believe it. Bayes is one of the most natural ways for us to think, and the great mathematician and scientist George Polya wrote in the opening of one of his books that we want systems of plausible reasoning, and for many of us who study Bayesian theory, it is the most natural way of coming up with systems of plausible reasoning. And in fact, Turing's work itself was all about this question of how is it that probability becomes systems of plausible reasoning. And so anyway, I'm going to say that, of course, many of us had to discover exactly what Turing did. We didn't use the word Bayes. We put that aside. It's like the Reverend Bayes will go and see your grave at Highgate Cemetery, and we will talk about systems of plausible reasoning, of accumulating evidence, of dealing with our prize and making what is subjective clear and obvious to all of us. So I thought I'd just poke you a little bit there, Dermot. But the life, the loss, the legacy of Turing is vital to all of us as scientists. It is a cause for celebration, but importantly, it is a cause for caution for all of us, and especially for those of us who are working in the field of artificial intelligence and machine learning today, who take so much inspiration, and we are directly, in some sense, inheritors of part of Turing's work, but of course of so many other people. So Turing enters the world of 1900, which begins, and already this idea of data, of automation is taking over the world. Already the ideas of possibility of new kind of technological futures are being created. And partly this is because of the introduction of the punch card, and then also this new field of statistics that then is sort of slowly emerging. So this is then where you find Turing is bathing in this kind of social environment, whether at Bletchley Park, whether it is time in the University of Cambridge, then at the University of Manchester. And during all of this time, these are the questions that he is asking. Well, what is this notion of computation, automation? How do we build better machines? Can a machine be intelligent? What does it mean to be intelligent? How can you know something is intelligent? How can you define intelligence? And in fact, these are the questions we are still asking all of ourselves today. So I suppose for all of us, one of Turing's most famous papers is called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And in here, you find him unpacking all of these kind of different questions. The first section of this paper is called The Imitation Game, which later became the title of an interpretive film, let's say. But in here, you see so many different ways of Turing's thinking around intelligence, machinery, computation unfolding. And we are still, as I said, asking those same kind of questions today. I suppose I wanted to just say that although we are inheriting that work and every researcher reads that, Turing was not alone during any of this time. In fact, Turing was vital to several other kinds of communities. One of them was the community of cybernetics, which we also take our inheritance and legacy from. There's this other vitally important field of information theory, and everyone who's done Bayesian statistics, if you wanted that alternative language, one of the things Turing was involved in was creating this language of information theory. And of course, information theory and Bayes are one-to-one in some sense. So there's sort of all of this other kind of questions which are going on. The questions of ultimately what came from that paper is this idea of the Turing test, that we can create a test to detect something is intelligent. We, of course, have named the Nobel Prize of Computer Science after Alan Turing, the A.M. Turing Prize. There is this vitally important part of theoretical computer science, which talks about what does it mean to create these kind of universal computation called Turing completeness. And of course, we have named our prestigious institutes of artificial intelligence and data science after Turing. So of course, his legacy is surrounding us all the time. I want to just maybe bring in this idea of querying that Clara just so rightly brought up into the conversation. So Turing's loss, in that sense, is a profound reminder to us of that importance of representation in science, but in society more generally today that we work on. LGBT scientists in particular continue to be faced in workplaces where they don't feel comfortable, where they are out, where there are higher incidents of mental health for us to deal with. And I think, we can do so much more, and that kind of questions of freedom, of better representation. Had we lived in a society that allowed for that, then we would have benefited more from Turing's impact and contributions in the world. Also, there's one maybe reverse point, that if we had lived in that kind of area of more representation, more equality, more freedom, Turing's work itself would have been better. There is a question, of course, Turing asked this question of what it means to be intelligent. But it never occurs in any of his writing, and it's not clear, did he ever ask the question of, well, what are the basis of this historical legacy of the word intelligence? He was living in a time where intelligence was used to create the racist society we lived in, a society of division and hierarchy, a society of colonialism that he himself was living in at that time. And if you had asked a different question, because of that representation, what the basis of this question of intelligence has these kind of darker undertone, that they have been used for harm, that the question of theoretical computer science is directly related to the question of a more advanced society, then I think Turing himself would have taken a very different role of work, and we have never seen that. And so Turing science itself was limited in some way. So I'll end there. I'll just say that is part of our inheritance today. It is our legacy and our pleasure, actually, to have that knowledge, that history, and to navigate the tension of history, of racism, of intelligence, of future technologies, and how we are going to deal with that is different. So I suppose this is the core question of querying. If we take seriously, just for a brief moment, that the things that we assume and take for granted in this world, like the question of intelligence, just might be different from what they seem, might be opposite, that is the core practice of querying artificial intelligence and querying machine learning.
I love it. Thank you so much. My PhD was in neuroscience, and I put 6 to 18-year-old children in MRI scanners, and I told them to lie really still. And they did a version of a cognitive task, which was, quote unquote, culture fair, which means that they were supposed to be, it's Raven's progressive nature disease, and it's culture fair, and it meant that there was no effect of culture on how people performed on this task. And about halfway through my degree, I realized, because I found some other writings, that that was just a complete lie. It's not in any way culture fair. You absolutely can train to do it. And if you sort of grow up in particular households or particular societies, you absolutely can learn how to do this task, and you do much better than other areas. So thank you so much for taking us through that. I'm going to take a breath and remind myself to remind everyone who's watching along on YouTube that you can ask us questions through Slido, and that link is on the YouTube page, and it will be in the chat. And so if you want to ask any questions, we're going to go to Sue and to David, but then we'll have a little bit of time to sort of come back to some of these points. Sue, I am curious to sort of have you think about going back a little bit to sort of the legacy of the work that was done at Bletchley Park. And as we know, it was apparently not entirely due to Alan Turing. There were lots of people who were there doing all of that work. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about sort of what Bletchley Park means to you. And I think you've written a little bit about a sort of blitz spirit, and I'm curious to know how you see some of that kind of coming together work that happened at Bletchley Park, and how that relates to sort of more like current events like the pandemic, for example.
Great, thanks very much, Kirstie. Yeah, so like a million things there to try and juggle in my head while I'm speaking, but thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, so I mean, I'm a computer scientist, and I hadn't actually heard of Alan Turing, I don't think, and I just knew very little about Bletchley Park until I went up there for the first time in 2003. And I was there for a meeting, but I went for a walk afterwards and bumped into these guys that were kind of tinkering away in a corner with this sort of amazing feat of engineering. I couldn't like work out what it was, which turned out to be Alan Turing's bomb machine rebuild, and they were about halfway through it. So I had a great chat with them about Alan Turing and his contribution, about the bomb machine, and the industrialization of the code breaking process, which I thought was incredible. But then I was asked why I was there, which was representing the UK's first online network for women in tech, which I'd set up in 1998, BCS Women. And when I talked about women and computing, they said, oh, well, you know, did you know that more than half the people that worked at Bletchley Park were women? And I was like, no, because I don't know. I just had this idea in my mind that it was about 50-old blokes wearing tweed jackets. I don't know where that came from at all. And so I said, how many people worked here? And they said more than 10,000. So that was kind of the beginning of a journey for me. Well, like nearly 20 years ago now, I guess, time rolls on, of being interested in Bletchley Park and what happened there, the code breakers, and finding out so much information. I went away that time and got some funding to run an oral history project to capture the memories of the women that worked at Bletchley Park, because there was almost nothing. I couldn't find anything online, and there was not much at the museum about the women that worked there, but there was 8,000 women there, and mainly young women as well. So I just found that incredible and wanted to kind of showcase that. And then it wasn't until the launch of that project that I actually found that Bletchley Park was struggling financially, and then ended up running a 3-year campaign, which I thought would take a couple of months to make sure that it was kind of saved for the nation. And so, you know, Alan Turing and Bletchley Park are just very dear to my heart, and really kind of to me signify things that I care deeply about, which is technology. You know, Alan Turing being the father of computer science, collaboration, you know, like everyone working together to solve critical problems in the world, and also diversity and inclusion. And, you know, I just feel that as time's gone on, you know, I'm in my 50s now, and it's been a delight to see that we have much more of a focus on diversity and inclusion now, and realizing that, you know, that's something that actually adds strength to everything, including problem solving. And, you know, so I think Turing and Bletchley Park are really kind of those three things together, I think, which are very important to me, are also represented by Bletchley Park. The way that everyone worked there together through the Second World War, no matter who they were. And again, many of them were very young women. And kind of someone mentions the Turing Awards just now, and I don't know how many years they've been given out, but I think only twice have they been given to women. And one of those women was actually Fran Allen, an incredible woman who kind of like coincidentally I knew through a friend of a friend, and she was coming over to the UK, and I think about 2009. So I had the absolute pleasure of taking her up to Bletchley Park and introducing her to Mavis Beatty, one of the major code breakers at Bletchley Park, who was actually only 18 when she was code breaking there. And it's just been one of the joys of my life to meet several of the code breakers. But that day is a really special day for me, introducing Fran to Mavis, and then them talking about computer science now, well, as it was then back in 2009, I think. And and Mavis talking about the code breaking that she was part of. It was just such a wonderful conversation to kind of like eavesdrop, and also just such a wonderful day to bring those two incredible women together. And I think, Bletchley Park, Alan Turing, it was all about, there's this massive problem during the Second World War, and thousands of people from all different sorts of backgrounds coming together to solve those problems. And, kind of like taking that forward to the modern day, with stuff like Brexit. I wrote a blog post about Brexit and how it was actually the opposite of that sort of indomitable British spirit of kind of everyone working together to overcome adversity. And, I really believe that what we should be doing now is collaborating. So collaborating as individuals, as organizations, but also as nations with each other. We've kind of got the tools now to be able to solve all the big problems in the world, I believe. And we can do that by thinking hard about having diverse expertise in the groups that we bring together to solve problems, and in working together, in collaborating to sort out all these issues. And I think Brexit is the opposite of that. Not that I want to harp on about Brexit at all. But again, I think, like with COVID and vaccinations, again, that's people, with a serious problem that needs solving, coming together to solve that problem, collaborating. And also, things that have happened. I ran the campaign to save Bletchley mainly through social media, particularly the sort of after about 6 months when I worked out how Twitter worked. So this was back in 2008. So you can forgive me for not knowing what to do with it, I think. And it's just been a joy for me to really see millions of people coming together now under hashtags like Black Lives Matter. People connecting across the world, bringing forward issues that really everyone needs to know about, and really, again, connecting people about the massive issues that we've got today. Shall I stop there? I'll go on forever if you don't stop me.
It's wonderful. I know there's so many different threads in there, and I think I just wrote down in my notes this word interconnected, and I think that's something that is so. I think it really resonates with me what Shakir was saying about the fact that the more interconnected the work, the better the science. So actually there's this fantastic thought about we can look back at role models and we can say they were really great. But what I think a lot about when I hear you speak about the many, many people at Bletchley Park, the thousands of people at Bletchley Park, is actually invisible labor. All of this work that was done by people who aren't commemorated on a £50 note, who aren't household names, who don't necessarily get big blockbuster movies made about them, but we're part of that effort. And there's a lot of mapping in actually in data science of techniques themselves, thinking about the interconnectedness of work, whether you're looking at sort of networks or you're looking at systems or you're looking at kind of how, just the example that you finished on there, you look at how coronavirus affects not just individuals, not just people in a household, not just people in a town or a city, but really across the whole country and then interconnected across the whole world. I'm going to come across to David. David and I both work at the Alan Turing Institute. And David, I'm just really curious to know, I know you know a lot about Alan Turing as a man and his life and his work, and now you work at the institute that's named after him. And I'm curious to know are there inspirations that you take from your knowledge of Alan Turing and his life and his work that you see manifest in your work, but maybe also our work in ethics and policy at the Turing Institute?
Sure, Kirstie. I mean, I think there's definitely at least a few inspirations that I think we carry with us from the legacy of Turing. First, I mean, you mentioned before intellectual bravery, and I would say one of my kind of inspirational moments from Turing is this idea that really comes through in his work, that mathematical and scientific discovery is not just a journey of intellectual bravery, but it's a journey of wonder, right? So, you know, Einstein famously wrote somewhere that wonder is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of all true art and science. And I think if you look back on Turing's life, this kind of impulse of wonderment was an emotional driver from his very earliest years. There's a great sketch in the archive that was drawn by his mom Sarah when he was a child that she had titled "Hockey or Watching the Daisies Grow." And in this sketch, you have a kind of a bunch of boys throwing themselves around in kind of heated competition. Sticks are everywhere, and then you've got Turing off to the side, kind of hunched over a patch of daisies and contemplating the mysteries of biology. And you know, the truth is this sketch would actually prove pretty prophetic, because just 3 decades later, a more mature Turing would write a paper called The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis, which employed real nonlinear partial differential equations to explain pattern formation in biological systems. And that was really a founding text of what would become known as mathematical or computational biology. I think another moment of wonder that we really haven't talked about yet, but I think it's just as interesting and important, is a 22-year-old Turing kind of wandering through Grantchester Meadows by the Cams in Cambridge and coming up with this idea that literally ended up changing the world. And this was obviously the idea of computation, or what an algorithm is. At this time, a generation of mathematics like Kurt Gödel, Alonzo Church, Emil Post had been stumped by this question of what it means to kind of carry out and effectively carry out a calculation, how to specify what an algorithm is. And they pretty much all gotten lost in the ethers of complicated formalisms and logico-deductive methods. But here comes Turing, a young 20-something person. He saw the problem with wonder. He saw it with the beginner's mind, and he returned mathematics basically to the beating heart of those who actually carry out computations, right? He took the human practitioner as a model to then draw this kind of what's now known as a Turing machine that showed how we carry out a kind of step-by-step process of calculation. And you know, we all know that this kind of invention of the Turing machine really ushered in the age of the general purpose computer. But what we really, I don't think, realize as much is the radicalness of this moment, and how Turing's new vision had kind of sort of changed the entire world. Because if we think of it, before this, literally nobody in the world had imagined that a single machine could apply countless strings of abstract symbols, now we know them as programs, and then use these to serve almost boundless functions in the world. This is now, we know this as the Turing machine, and it was Turing's kind of visionary pragmatism in bringing this kind of world of logic and metamathematics back down to earth that literally recreated the world for the digital age. So that, I would say, wonder is probably one of my most kind of inspirational themes from Turing. I could mention another one if I might. Another one I think for me that's really important is this idea that we need to think of humility, human connection, and commitment to making the world a better place as the principal drivers of mathematical and scientific discovery. And I think this is kind of implicit in a lot of Turing's work. He liked to say that mathematical insight and innovation originate in 2 things. First, in common sense, so in this idea that we are practically engaged in the world, and that in our ongoing efforts to kind of cope with its problems, we cooperate with each other in order to do that. And second, an idea that he wrote about in a 1948 paper called Intelligent Machinery, which is this idea of intellectual and cultural search. This idea that humanity is kind of involved in an indefinite project of collaborative discovery that's carried out for the benefit of humanity as a whole. And so taken together, these moments, this endeavor of common sense and intellectual and cultural search I would say, made Turing's mathematics and made his science literally warm-blooded and very social. It viewed the problems and methods that scientists and mathematicians employed as being animated within a kind of human community that's indefinitely struggling with real-world challenges and the challenges that they face to improve humanity as a whole. And so I don't talk kind of endlessly about this, but I would just say that downstream from this, as being a thinker, scientist, philosopher at the Institute, I think we try to pick up on the stream of responsible research and innovation that derives from this idea that we are involved in science, but science with and for society, and that in a sense, science it needs to be an inclusive, democratic, and interdisciplinary practice that is oriented to benefiting the biosphere and the globe as a whole. So yeah, I think those are probably the two that I would say.
Right. It's not a difficult task, right? It's just something to keep us occupied a little bit, to just go ahead and change the world. Thank you all so much for all of your thoughts. I'm going to turn to the Slido questions that have come from the viewers who are watching on YouTube. And just as a reminder that we've got about sort of 20 minutes for questions and a little bit of closeout at the end. So there's still time to add in questions if anyone that's watching at home would like to ask one. There's one question that I think our communications and events team are going to answer offline, which is to say, is there any program to support minorities, gay, women, Black people before their application to the Institute? And we'll answer that offline. But I wanted to link that question to one from Black women in artificial intelligence. And now I want to be clear. I think this is not someone who is speaking for all Black women in artificial intelligence. This is a community that brings together Black women in AI to support them to nurture sort of maybe confidence over both internal sort of imposter syndrome barriers, but also those real barriers, those real structural barriers that exist at the intersections of various lived experiences. And so I want to shout out to Black women in artificial intelligence and say thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all of the work that you do. But their question is, how do we define intelligence? And how can it be tested without bias? And I want to sort of just open that up to panel, your thoughts on intelligence, natural, artificial, how we define it, how we implement it. Is there anyone who would like to go first on that question? Clara, go for it.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can necessarily answer or give you a definitive answer, definitely when it comes to removing, biases in there. But I think it was interesting because I think Dermot mentioned this intellectual bravery and being willing to sort of challenge and try new things. But we're also seeing the rise in pseudo intellectual bravery at the moment, where people, think that they are definitely experts, despite the fact that they've not had training and don't necessarily have the tools available to really be those genuine experts. And also to Dermot's point, I as an LGBT advocate and especially as a trans woman on the internet, I know that discrimination's not finished. I think when we see real intelligence, for me, one measure of that is knowing your limitations, knowing what you don't know, being willing to learn, wanting to figure out new things, wanting to listen to other people. And this is also comes into the whole being part of a group, because we work better together. Sometimes I like my own space, but we work so much better as a group because ideas bounce off each other. I am terrible for remembering facts and numbers. You ask me some, the basics of material science. And I'm like, I can't remember, but I can figure out how to get that information. And so being able to work in a group and, being willing to, if someone corrects you, I learned so much. I thought that I was a really good race ally last year. And it turns out that there's an awful lot more learning that I had to do. And I was willing, I didn't see that as, I didn't worry about that when people corrected me. I didn't get offended. I was like, oh my goodness, you're right. I can still learn more stuff. And that's a good thing. And I think intelligence is the pursuit of wanting to know more answers, for me at least.
I love that. And I think it really links in with what David was talking about the sort of humility that's needed. David, do you want to add in your thoughts on intelligence broadly?
Yeah, and it does connect with this notion of humility. I think if you look over the course of the reception of Turing's paper on the Turing test and his other, he engaged in this in other venues as well. Even before that, in 47, I think he had talked about it. But I think if you really look closely and you read closely, you realize that actually Turing doesn't really have what we might think of as an epistemological conception of intelligence, which is to say, for him, intelligence isn't something that's out there in the world that can simply be replicated in machines. In fact, in the Mind paper, he sort of responds to the question. He says, the question, can machines think, is too absurd to be worthy of consideration, right? He says that in the paper. And where he turns a different direction is the same space that he turns in his computability theory work, which is to say he deflates the question and returns the question to a kind of pragmatic notion or relational notion of intelligence as how we relate to each other. And that's why the Turing test is all about a kind of social interactive relationship. And so there's been a tendency, I think, to see Turing as being this behaviorist that operationalizes the notion of intelligence that then can be reduced to a certain structure of measurement, which will tend then to reify intelligence. But I think he was much more nuanced than that. He had been in conversations with the philosopher Wittgenstein in the late 30s, and he had picked up a lot. There was a kind of an ethos in Cambridge at the time where this notion of mindedness, which was a Cartesian residual, was treated with a little bit of horror. So I think there's just been a tendency to kind of caricature Turing's perspective on intelligence, and just would flag that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And there's a couple of people who are commenting in the chat saying that they really love the sort of passion that's coming across from all of the members of the panel. And thank you all so much again for joining us today. I want to just throw to Dermot. We were sort of chatting earlier about there's a big difference, an important difference, I think, between intelligence and learning. And I suppose bias can sort of creep into our understandings of both of those in different ways. And I don't know if you would want to expand on that a little.
Well, thank you. I'm not going to challenge anything that Clara or David said, because I agree with all of it. But it seemed to me that I wondered where the question was coming from. There's been a lot of commentary recently about what are loosely called AI systems and bias in AI. And I think actually that's, maybe this is a sort of a legal point, a sort of a lawyer speaking, but it seems to me that muddles up the concepts of machine learning, where we teach systems how to recognize things, and those systems then come back and reflect back to us the biases that we built into the way that machine learning actually evolves. And that seems to me to be it's a valid problem, and it's one that we should not ignore. It's one that we ignore at our peril. But it seems to me that machine learning is not the whole of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is a much bigger subject that embraces the kinds of concepts that Clara and David were talking about. And I'm less confident that we have got a bias problem in those areas. We've still got bias problems of the type that Sue was talking about earlier, which are that we don't get enough women into STEM subjects, and we don't find that particularly certain ethnic minority groups, not all of them, but certain ethnic minority groups are similarly underrepresented in STEM subjects at A level and beyond. These are things that we need to work on to make sure that the biases don't creep in systematically into the AI industry. But frankly, I think that we need to distinguish in our minds when we're talking about intelligence that machine learning is just it's a chapter in the AI story.
Thank you so much for that perspective. I think it's really interesting to sort of see the way that people from different backgrounds, so in your case, that legal sort of perspective, interact differently with the questions. Sue, I'm going to stick on this question of intelligence because I think it's really interesting, and I want to hear from all of the panel members about it. Sue, I think you have a new institute at Durham University that's specifically looking at bias in AI. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you're sort of building up that research program?
Sure, thanks very much, Kirstie. Yeah, so I'm always interested in, like I said earlier, bringing people together to solve real world problems. And my background is software engineering, so not specifically AI, but I kind of, in my kind of worldview of everything that's happening, see more and more issues around the use of AI and how it's not being produced or used well. For example, around facial recognition and in all different sorts of ways, and really wanted to do something about it. So I've set up a research group at Durham called the Bias in AI Group, which really focuses on bringing people together. So not just academics, but people from government and industry and academia together to talk about the issues as we see it and work out where we think the biggest problems are, and then work together to do something to go some way towards solving that problem or those problems. And it's interesting. So one of my PhD students, Sarah, when she started, we were talking about bias in AI, and I was new to the area about a year ago. And so I was saying to her, it might take us some time to find specific bias, blah, blah, blah. We were looking at the language models produced by OpenAI, like GPT-2 and GPT-3. So I said it might take some time to find the bias. So she started kind of playing around, and it took about 5 seconds to find some bias, which was, when you ask the GPT-2, for example, language model, when you just type in women can, or men can, or in particular, Black women can or Black women can't, you just get ridiculous amounts of violence, misogyny, all sorts of awful stuff. And that's just from like a 10, 20 second interaction. And that's one of the sort of more famous kind of AI kind of services or models that's out there. So it's a massive, massive problem. And if anyone's interested in joining us in the Bias in AI group that cares about that, I'd love to hear from them.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's there's a few really, really fantastic books that have been written by Black women about those biases that exist. And I think we've sort of transitioned a little bit from thinking about intelligence to thinking about sort of the specific implementation of machine learning right now, to kind of starting to transition into bias. And I just want to acknowledge that we're hitting quite a few of these different topics, and they're not all the same. But one of the hard parts about answering the question about what is intelligence is that you start to pull on all of these different threads in the different directions. Shakir, like I said, I wanted to hear from everyone, so I want to hear your thoughts on intelligence. But I was also struck. Sue was saying that it's not just academics, it's people from government as well, people who might have sort of lived experience that are affected by the implementations of the algorithm. And I don't know if everyone who's watching will necessarily know what DeepMind's mission is. So I'm wondering if you can also sort of fold into your thoughts on intelligence a little bit more about what the DeepMind organization are doing.
Yeah, we spoke about so much of like where to begin, but I suppose maybe I'll take that question a little bit more literally to begin with, and then unpack it. I think we spoke about bias, we spoke about systems of development, the difference of machine learning, where our data is coming from, its externalities in the real world. maybe we can do, as David said, distill that question down into specific objects, and then we pick the object up and we look at it. And I think you can kind of do that. Today, we wouldn't say it's an absurd kind of question. We actually take that question much more seriously. We say, well, if we wanted to think about different kinds of intelligence, and actually there's a really important note here about the bias of thought, actually, that we somehow discard animal intelligence or other forms of intelligence. We think of them as lesser than ourselves, then that's a different question for us to really contend with, because it is a fundamental element of oppression that's built into basically everything we're doing. But let's leave that aside and we can talk about it another time. If you did want to, then you could take so many different elements. You could say, well, if we wanted to build this intelligent machine and we wanted to take this kind of behaviorist view, or we wanted to take this inspiration from cognitive science or human behavior or ethology, then we would say, well, humans are intelligent because they know how to use tools. Well, let's look at the question of tool use, and then you can ask the question in animal. Or humans are intelligent because we engage with each other in a social learning process. Well, let's look at this question of multi-agent learning and those kind of questions. Humans are intelligent because the thing that's so profound is that we have memory. And as the great cognitive scientist wrote, that humans have a power that nothing else can do, which we can bend the arc of time. We can go backwards because we have the power of memory, which other things don't have. So there's so many, and we can then pick each of these kind of questions up. And of course, now the ecosystem means that each of us in academia can study that question, but the role then, there's equally a question of organizations like DeepMind, where I am, to also say, well, we can take a different mode of answering those kind of questions. So in DeepMind, we think of ourselves as an AGI company with a mission to solve intelligence, to advance science and humanity. And there's this triple of the question, the research question, the scientific question of intelligence, related to that question of science and serving humanity and sort of how we advance the fundamental prosperity of nature. And that kind of triple is sort of what we are working on and doing. So I'll hopefully that's a little bit there, but I think, you have to connect that question to other ways of thinking about intelligence. This big data is another thing. Do we need to do all of this memory, and do we need to do all of this kind of behavioral assessment? Do we need to think about memory? Maybe we just collect all the data. And I think this is what Dermot was sort of critiquing a little bit. There are limitations to that thinking, as there are limitations to any form of scientific thinking. And perhaps the real bias that comes in is for us to seriously take care about the ecosystem that we are working in, that no single place, change needs to happen in many places at once, where the data is coming from and who is labeling, what kind of researchers are doing it, where that research is happening. If it only happens in industries and corporations, then that is dangerous for us all, right? If it only happens in academia, that is equally dangerous, because there are kinds of groupthink which sets in. How do we allow criticism of work, and what does it mean to meaningfully take seriously criticism and not marginalize people as troublemakers, as people who don't know what they're talking about, as the anti-scientific? There are serious questions for us to consider. All of these are beyond the simple question of bias. They are sort of the question of how we truly advance science for this benefit of humanity, and sort of, that joy and wonder that David reminded us so importantly is part of why we do any of this.
I love it. I spend a lot of time thinking about sort of a lack of reproducibility in science, or people don't share their code, so it's difficult to tell what they did. And there's lots of reasons why they don't do it. But one of the things that I often say to people when they're having sort of existential crises about whether they want to continue a research career is, I say some of the bad days are pretty bad. You can feel like you are not succeeding on any axis. But a good day is really beautifully joyful, and I can see lots of nods across the panel. I think we all agree with David and Shakir on that framing. I think we can squeeze in one last short question from the audience, which is this one from Steve asking, and I'm going to direct it at Dermot. What do you think would be the most effective way to reframe the popular public perception of Alan Turing's legacy?
It's a very intriguing question, and I don't have a simple answer to it, but I would like to set an agenda to begin with, and then we can perhaps think about how we might achieve it. I think the agenda should be to stop thinking about Alan Turing or rather Alan Turing's legacy, as being something that happened in the past and something that makes us somehow feel nostalgic and warm and a bit complacent about things like winning the war by dint of non-bloody code breaking at Bletchley Park, rather than the really horrid things that actually did happen in World War II. And thinking about how proud we can be of ourselves for having turned the corner on gay rights. I think we've debunked both those myths today. And so we know that's not what the Alan Turing's legacy should be about. I think we're beginning to get to what Alan Turing's legacy should in fact be about. And it's about things like continuing to work hard on correcting the underrepresentation of certain classes of people in STEM subjects, which would be continuing Alan Turing's own mission on that stuff. I think it should be about continuing the debate that he started in the late 1940s on intelligent machinery. And I'm delighted that nobody yet has said something about robots taking over the world, which is one of those sort of idiot myths that typically gets mentioned. So I'm going to be the idiot that mentions it, and you can all laugh at me as you are all doing. And so we can now put that one back in its box. I think those are amongst some of the things that I think we should be using Alan Turing's reputation to achieve in the future. So it really is about what we're going to do from now going forward. It's not about patting ourselves on the back and looking backwards. So the key part of this question, though, is how should we do this? What can we do in terms of action points to take forward to positively impact science and society and actually sort of make a big difference? I suspect, Kirstie, you're probably going to have to throw that one open to everybody. But I would just say that I admire some of the work that we've already talked about on this panel that is going on to try and push forwards that more future-focused agenda. It's inspired by Alan Turing. It's if you like, an extrapolation of what he was doing. And I think, frankly, it's probably happening anyway. I'm not sure that there's any sort of specific recipe that I can come up with, because I can see loads of things going on, particularly lots of really inspired work about getting girls interested in mathematics at primary school level. I can see some really exciting stuff going on from the panelists, amongst others, about pushing forward intelligent thinking about AI. I'm already corresponding separately with a bunch of people about how we can push forward STEM careers for kids from ethnic minority backgrounds where that's not considered to be an appropriate part of their career agenda. So, you know, it is happening. It is happening. I think we just got to get behind these projects and support them.
Thank you so much. So I have a closeout question for everyone on the panel. Although Dermot, I think you might have already answered it, so you can go super brief if you'd like to. But the closeout question is, what is your vision for how we should remember Alan Turing, and what specific action points we can take forward to positively impact science and society as a whole? So, you know, I'm going to ask you basically to answer this in just, you know, 1.5 minutes, and no big deal. We just want you to positively impact science and society as a whole. But I'm curious to hear all of your perspectives on this. David, would you like to go first on this one?
Sure. I mean, I think for me, if we look back at Turing's life and the 40 plus years that he was on the earth, and then we think about all of the contributions that his insights have made to change, changing so much of our society. I also think about how there's maybe 50 years that we've lost of that potential contribution, right? Because of the prematurity of his demise. And so for me, I think what I take from that is that there's a legacy that's a responsibility that we all bear from Turing's life, that his commitment to living his truth despite prejudice, and ultimately the way that that's an affirmation of the moral demands for self-expression and dignity, especially in the face of persecution, that makes us all responsible to advance the rights of people, to make sure that we can secure that all among us are accepted without exception and are able to fully realize ourselves in our professional and public lives for who we are and how we define ourselves, and that we should all be able to speak freely and to live our own truths as we are. And I think that the best service that we can do in the wake of Turing's life is to carry that forward and to do it every day.
Thank you so much. Shakir, what's your vision?
Yeah, I would like us all just to remember that we are inheritors of this legacy of Turing, of someone who was a critical thinker, who was multifaceted in multiple areas of science, who did wonder in their work. And this kind of exceptional scientist is something that we remember, we celebrate, and we use to inspire our own work. But at the same time, to remember that probably Turing was not that exceptional, no more exceptional than any of us, no more exceptional than the young person in South Africa, where I am from today, who can make the same degree of contribution, if not more. And that we should expand our mind as we celebrate Turing. We look beyond just Turing to find all those other voices, all those stories that can inspire us to advance our society in all the ways that we don't get to see, because those people are also not represented, also don't get to contribute. So I would like to say maybe specifically what we should do for each of us, especially if you have a voice, with our Secretary of State for Education, with our Prime Minister, to increase our science funding here in the UK to 5% of GDP or more. That each of us should break barriers as scientists to work across multiple disciplines, that the scientific field and the social field and the humanistic field are one field, and we work across them. We do what Turing did, put ourselves in the situation of being naive to then ask new kinds of critical questions. That every person supports grassroots organizations who operate across the world, because the grassroots organizations see the problems already. They create new spaces of dialogue. They create the next generation of intellectuals that will help us, actually, as we are all getting older, in different kinds of ways, whether that's the LGBT Seminar or OSTEM, the Deep Learning Endowment, so many organizations everywhere across the world. And maybe just, as always, for us to continue to be joyful, to continue to look for hope, even in such times. And as long as we continue to work together, I think there's so much for us to look forward to. So thank you for having me today, and thank you to this amazing panel.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Clara, please take us forward with your vision.
Yeah, so I'm probably going to upset some people on this panel. It's really easy to hate on films. I personally have views on The Danish Girl, for instance. But they're still an interesting jumping off point, because they start us talking about history, and we start to learn the true history. We start to learn who was really involved. And so they can be really useful. And then we can start talking about those people. I was talking about role models, but make sure that if you're inviting in a black geologist or a gay astrophysicist, that they're talking about astrophysics or geology, not just talking about being LGBT or disabled or the color of their skin. So it's all about having real role models and using that as a jumping off point. I'm running a series of webinars with the group Tigers in STEM. We're running a chemistry webinar after this. People are talking about chemistry, and it turns out that there's not one type of person that's a chemist. We all look very different and are very different. And it's a shame with the LGBT seminar, which I ran in January. I still have flashbacks of Christmas. Running a conference on the 8th of January isn't a sensible thing to do. But we also want to just make sure that we keep an eye on the past. So a lot of I talked about Section 28. There's a lot of similar laws going around Europe right now. And even here, potentially, we're talking about the legacy of Section 28, but there's still some people that want to have a similar law for trans people in the UK. And we've seen the pushback against anti-racism. The government's one response to the Black Lives Matter last year was to ban protests in certain ways. And so we've got to make sure that we're keeping an eye on the past so that we're not repeating our mistakes.
Thank you so much, Clara. I completely agree. Sue, would you like to share your vision?
Thank you. Yeah, I think the three things I talked about with Alan Turing, brings to me technology, collaboration, and diversity and inclusion, but particularly inclusion. What I've found through my life, when when I was a PhD student, I kind of had at a conference that was 90% guys and 10% women, I had this sudden realization that I was a woman in STEM or a woman in tech and not just a computer scientist. And it wasn't until actually I went to a Women in Science conference that I suddenly had that experience of being in the majority, because it was all women. And that's just such a wonderful experience. And I think, you know, we need to create situations where everyone can feel in the majority, and we need to make sure that we really think hard about helping everyone to feel included. You know, and if we think of Alan Turing, and you know, it's kind of been mentioned already, but you know, if he'd been in an inclusive society where he was treated properly, who knows how much more he could have done in his lifetime. And you know, I'm really, really keen for us all to think hard about how to bring together teams which include people with all different sorts of backgrounds and expertise, because that's the best way to solve problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And I know, Dermot, you sort of gave a little bit of a vision earlier on, but is there anything that you want to add?
Let me just finish with this thought that when it picks up on what Sue was just saying, I think Alan Turing was inspired to begin his career in science, bearing in mind that he came from that imperial legacy family that other panelists were talking about earlier. I think he was inspired to go down a completely different route, the science route, because of the influence of his mother. And his mother, my grandmother, came from a family called the Stoneys, where they had more FRSs than I've had sausages for breakfast in the last 24 years, I should think. A really quite extraordinary bunch of people, including, and here's the most remarkable thing about it, including two cousins of my grandmother who were called Ethel and Florence Stoney. These women were both very intelligent. Of course, in those days, universities like Cambridge didn't award degrees to women. Otherwise, I'd be able to say that they were Cambridge graduates, but they weren't, but they would have been. And these women went off to become radiologists. And there's a beautiful photograph of my ancestor, Edith Stoney, teaching physics to women medical students in 1913. So this is before World War I. We've got women medical students who are training to be doctors being taught physics by a woman physicist, who then became an expert radiologist in World War I and won several medals for doing so. She was also a bit of a pain to work for, but I don't sort of, frankly, we've all met people who are a bit of a pain to work for. I think that was a very inspiring piece in his family history, and I'm absolutely confident that my grandmother was banging on about these people, and in particular Edith and Florence's dad, who was one of the many FRSs on her side of the family. We are talking about role models, and we are talking about how as a society we have gone backwards in the last 100 years or so, and it's now our duty to turn the machine round and go forwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And we have just hit 2 o'clock, so I have done a pretty good job on timekeeping. I'm going to keep us for 1 more minute to let everyone who's watching know that we'll have a Turing lecture next month by Nicole Turner-Lee, looking at mitigating algorithmic bias in AI systems. So folks who've been listening to this will be very interested in that work. And you can register for that and other public events at the Turing website at turing.com/events. And also, I want to shout out that the Alan Turing Institute is working with the AI Council to gather views on the AI ecosystem. And we want to hear from anyone who is researching, developing, working with, or using AI technologies in order to help shape the government's AI strategy. So please scan that code to take part, or you can find the link in the chat. And the deadline for that survey is Sunday, the 20th of June. So if you have time in the next few days to share your thoughts on that, the form is both short and long, as in you can fill it in very quickly, or you can add in lots of extra text if you if you have additional expertise that you would like to share or thoughts that you would like to share. And I'll finish by thanking Johnny again for his fantastic moderation of the chat. I really enjoyed seeing a couple of other shout outs to him. And also Jesse and Dan, who have organized this event, brought everyone together and kept all of our IT moving so smoothly. And finally, thank you obviously so much to Dermot, Sue, Clara, Shakir and David for your time on the panel today, but actually sort of more importantly, the work that you're doing and the empowerment that you're bringing to as many people as possible in the data science and artificial intelligence ecosystem. Thank you everyone so much, and have a lovely day wherever you happen to be.
Thank you, bye.